but to make it conditional on Australia, as well as the UK, having 2030 targets consistent with 1.5 degrees.
President?
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his new role? My only disappointment is that the phrase shadow COP president doesn't appear in his title, but this is where I think he can take some lessons from the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party about how to expand the number of portfolios you've got. But specifically on the point of Australia, can I just confirm to him that the trade deal will include a substantive chapter on climate change, which reaffirms both parties' commitments to upholding our obligations under the Paris Agreement, including limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know I am shadowing the department that he would quite like to run, so maybe that will be an announcement that is forthcoming in the future, and I'm mildly encouraged by what he says on Australia. Let me take two other issues where he can show leadership: the Cumbria coal mine and the Cambo oil field, the equivalent of 18 coal-fired power stations running for a year. He knows that we need to get others to phase out coal. He knows we need to phase out fossil fuels. Surely the right way to send the proper signal to the rest of the world ahead of COP27 is for the whole of the government to start practicing what he is effectively preaching and put a stop to Cambo and Cumbria.
Mr. Speaker, I just say to him, and we've had this discussion in the dispatch box previously, both in terms of Canberra and Cumbria, he will know that they're being looked at by independent regulators and there will be pronouncements coming forward. More specifically in terms of coal, of course we have reduced significantly the amount of coal on our electricity mix. In fact, there will be no more coal in the electricity mix in the UK from 2024.
SNP spokesperson Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I commend the President and his team for all their hard work over COP26. But one issue missing from the Prime Minister's ambition for COP26 was fossil fuels generally. It's clear we need action to tackle the use of fossil fuels globally, but to do so in a way that supports a just transition for workers. Does the President agree that not having a concrete commitment from COP for a global just transition from fossil fuels is a disappointment, and that following the Scottish Government's example in delivering a just transition and opposing further oil exploration would set a strong example for the next COP?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do support a just transition. In fact, the deal that was agreed with South Africa, the $8.5 billion deal agreed with South Africa, will enable decarbonisation and a just transition in that country. And we also now have 34 countries and 5 public finance institutions which are supporting a UK-led initiative to end international public support for unabated fossil fuel energy sector by the end of 2022.
Number 5, please.
Mr. Speaker, at COP26, leaders of countries representing over 70% of global GDP committed to work together to make clean technologies and sustainable solutions the most affordable, accessible and attractive option in each emitting sector before the end of this decade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Teesside is quickly becoming the epicentre for hydrogen technology in the UK, with recent announcements on blue and green hydrogen production. We are confident that Teesside will be able to deliver more than half of the government's 2030 hydrogen ambitions. Around 85% of all homes are on the gas network, and domestic heating accounts for over 30% of the UK's CO2 emissions. It's clear to me that we won't make net zero without switching our gas network to 100% hydrogen. So can the Minister recognise hydrogen as a fuel of the future, and will he join me in my campaign for the UK's first hydrogen village in Redcar?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. Hydrogen is a fuel of the future, and as he will know, that the idea of a hydrogen village trial was proposed in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, and indeed gas network companies are working with local partners to develop proposals for the trial. Could I suggest he speaks to my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, to make the case for Redcar as well?
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The territories of the world's 370 million Indigenous peoples cover 24%. Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous people's voices were represented throughout COP26, and of course the UK Government funded the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion in the Blue Zone. We will continue to amplify Indigenous people's voices during our presidency year.
Martin Doherty.
I'm grateful for the President's response. The territories, as I was saying, of the world's 370 million Indigenous people cover 24% of the land of the world worldwide and contain 80% of the world's biodiversity, including sites of precious natural resources. It's they who protect forests vulnerable to the encroachment of modernity which has caused climate change. Therefore, does the President agree that given Indigenous communities are successful in maintaining control of their territories and traditions against the onslaught of man-made climate change, it's time for them to be treated as equal partners in decision-making processes, including the United Nations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, we will absolutely amplify the voice of Indigenous peoples, but as you will also know, the UK worked with others to mobilise a pledge of at least $1.7 billion over the next 5 years to ensure that there is support for Indigenous peoples, particularly when it comes to forest tenure rights.
Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COP26 agreed that... But I agree. Number 9. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 9 and 13 together. We can say with credibility that at COP26 we kept 1.5 degrees alive, but as I acknowledged in Glasgow and indeed here, its pulse is weak, and that is why we now need to turn commitments from countries into action.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. COP26 agreed that the Paris Climate Agreement must now be implemented to keep global warming below 1.5. But it's been revealed that the UK has emitted around 50 million tonnes of carbon in the past 5 years from collapsing peatlands alone. I asked the Minister this last time, and I'll ask him again. Where is the climate leadership on this, in this government, in allowing 2/3 of UK peatlands to be burnt while the world is on fire?
President.
Mr. Speaker, as you will know, we do have a peat strategy, which I'm sure my colleagues in DEFRA would be happy to share with her. But I would just say more widely is that as a country, we have decarbonised our economy faster in recent years than any other G7 or G20 nation.
Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the oil of Cambo and the coal of Cumbria have to stay in the ground if we're to keep temperatures at below 2.4 degrees centigrade. And I say 2.4 degrees centigrade because that's the new reality after this year's COP26. So, will the COP President commit to stopping Cambo and the new coal mine in Cumbria and end the climate hypocrisy that so undermined his presidency at COP26?
Mr. Speaker, I responded to the Honourable Gentleman earlier on the issue of Cambo and Cumbria. I would just say to him more generally that I recognise that we need to work very hard during our presidency here to ensure that commitments by all countries are turned into action. That's what we will be doing.
Andy Carter.
Topic order number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
President. Mr. Speaker, at COP26 we won historic commitments from countries and businesses to act on coals, cars, cash and trees. Countries have also committed to revisit and strengthen by the end of 2022 their 2030 emission reduction commitments to align with the Paris temperature goals. And after 6 years we finalised the outstanding rules governing the Paris Agreement. But of course, as I've said, we need to ensure that commitments are turned into action.
Andy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his incredible work at the COP26 summit in Glasgow? And will my right honourable friend continue to work with schools and youth groups through the rest of his presidency? And can I invite him to Warrington to come and meet some young people in my constituency?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his kind words, and of course I commend the work of young people in his constituency, and I will ensure that my diary works so I can visit them.
Jessica Morton.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my constituent Poppy, who was one of the young people at COP26, what are the government doing to help ensure that aid gets directly to those communities affected by climate change now, like the Wampies living in the Amazon that Poppy met and whose plight she was deeply moved by?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises an important point. There is one issue is about the quantum of money, the other is access to finance, and that's why we are now launching 5 pilot projects in developing countries around the world to ensure that access to finance is much better.
Dr. James Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will know the increasing importance of North Wales in supplying clean and green energy to the national grid. Further to COP26, how would he describe prospects for tidal range technology in the region?
President.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, of course, is a great champion for his community on this particular issue. He will know that the government remains open to considering well-developed proposals for harnessing tidal range energy in the bays and estuaries around our coastlines. But obviously, I would recommend he also speaks to the business department.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to Friends of the Earth, there are 33,000 premature deaths a year in the UK linked with air pollution. During the COP26 climate summit, the environmental bill passed through its final stages in this House, and it shamefully didn't include the legally binding targets for air quality that were called for by so many, including hundreds of my constituents in Liverpool, West Derby. As the UK retains the COP26 presidency, will it lead by example and bring in the extra measures needed to clean up our air?
Mr. Speaker, he raised a very important point, but of course air pollution has reduced significantly since 2010, and our Clean Air Strategy proposes a comprehensive suite of actions required across all parts of government to improve air quality.
Slade Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the success of the North Devon Climate Summit, my constituents are keen to understand how can we empower people to make their own choices on a global scale?
President.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my honourable friend, indeed her constituents, for the success of the North Devon Climate Summit. Every government needs to play its part, and I'm pleased the UK government's Together for Our Planet campaign provides practical advice on how everyone can go one step greener.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Synthetic aircraft fuels are still in their infancy. Domestically, the government has a tool, the Renewable Transport Fuels Obligation, by which the government can mandate the mixing of synthetic fuels with conventional aircraft fuel, thereby starting the process of making synthetic fuels viable. Is he aware of any similar mechanisms of other countries so we can start with an international agreement on mixing synthetic fuels with aircraft fuels and driving the route to net zero?
Come on.
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Lady knows, the government is putting funding behind sustainable aviation fuels. I'd be very happy to arrange a meeting for her with the Transport Secretary, or indeed a Transport Minister.
Final question, Ruth Edmonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I particularly welcome the COP outcome relating to deforestation, which saw 130 countries representing 90% of the world's forests pledge to end deforestation by 2030. And can I ask my right honourable friend, how will this be monitored and what steps will be taken if countries don't keep their word?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point. The 90% of forests that are covered by this pledge are also being backed by £14 billion of public and private funding, so there will be a mechanism for checks and balances. In addition, we agreed the transparency framework at COP26, so we will be able to see whether countries are meeting the commitments that they have made.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We now start with questions to the Prime Minister. Bima Palome.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, today I'm wearing a purple tie in recognition of the International Day of People with Disabilities this coming Friday. In July, we published the UK's first national disability strategy to help create a society that works for everybody. Mr. Speaker, I know that the thoughts of the whole House will be with those continuing to face disruption caused by Storm Arwen. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, will update the House on the continuing response to Storm Arwen after these questions. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and I have a shared commitment to protecting our natural environment and improving our biodiversity across the country. Indeed, it's why I'm campaigning to extend the Chilterns area of natural beauty towards the southwest of Hitchin. Would my right honourable friend set out how he plans to strengthen the protections for our countryside, whilst also ensuring that housing developments are both green and sustainable for the long term?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I can tell my honourable friend that Natural England is considering an extension of the Chilterns Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, and I'm sure they will listen to his passionate appeal very carefully.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his words on disability and the victims of extreme weather? Can I also mark World AIDS Day? Extraordinary advances mean people living with HIV on effective treatment can now enjoy normal life expectancy and are no longer at risk of passing on the virus. It's within our hands to end new transmissions in the UK this decade. We must do so, Mr. Speaker. As millions of people were locked down last year, was a Christmas party thrown in Downing Street for dozens of people on December the 18th?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during Number 10. And can I recommend to the right honourable gentleman that he does the same with his own Christmas party, which he's advertised for December the 15th, to which unaccountably he's failed to invite the deputy leader, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Nice try, but that won't work. Mr. Speaker, the defence seems to be no rules were broken. Well, I've got the rules that were in place at the time Prime Minister of this party. They're very clear, Mr. Speaker. You must not have a work Christmas lunch or party. Does the Prime Minister really expect the country to believe that while people were banned from seeing their loved ones at Christmas last year, it was fine for him and his friends to throw a boozy party in Downing Street?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've said what I've said about Number 10 and the events of 12 months ago, but he since asked about what we're asking the country to do this year, Mr. Speaker, which I think is, frankly, a more relevant consideration. The important thing to do, Mr. Speaker, is not only to follow the guidance which we have set out, but also when it comes to dealing with the Omicron variant, to make sure that, as we've said, that you wear a mask on public transport and in shops, Mr. Speaker, and that you self-isolate if you come into contact with somebody who has Omicron, Mr. Speaker. And above all, what we're doing is strengthening our measures at the borders, but particularly, and I think this will be very valuable for everybody to hear, get your booster, Mr. Speaker. I know the right honourable gentleman is eligible for his booster. I'm not going to ask him, Mr. Speaker, since I'm forbidden to ask him questions, but I hope very much that he's had it.
Well, I can tell the Prime Minister I've had mine. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says we should concentrate on what he's asking the country to do. We're asking the country to follow the rules. Yep. Now, the Prime Minister doesn't deny there was a Downing Street Christmas party last year. He's not denied it. He says no rules were broken. Both of those things can't be true, Prime Minister. He's taking the British public for fools. And as for following the rules, Prime Minister, it might be good just to look behind you when it comes to the question of masks. As ever, one rule for them, another rule for everybody else. Mr. Speaker, at the last election, the Prime Minister promised to build 40 new hospitals, page 10 of his manifesto. With waiting lists so high, Prime Minister, it's a very, very important commitment. Now, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury have checked on progress, and it's reported that they've reached a damning conclusion. I know the Chancellor would have seen that. They've concluded that the project needs a red flag because it's unachievable. Prime Minister, is that true?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with... He plays politics and asks frivolous questions, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, and we're putting we're putting record investments into the NHS on top of the 34 billion with which we began, and then the 97 billion that we put in to fight COVID. We, Mr. Speaker, are helping to build another 40 new hospitals with an injection of £36 billion of investment, Mr. Speaker, which that party voted against.
Keir Starmer.
Well, this is strange, Mr. Speaker, because the government hasn't been denying the reports about the red flag, and they haven't done since, but now the Prime Minister does. There's obviously some confusion on these benches over whether the Cabinet Office and the Treasury think he's on course to break yet another promise, this time on new building of hospitals. So he can clear this up this afternoon. If he's so confident in his answer, why doesn't he publish the progress report in full and let us all see it?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is not only building 14 new hospitals, but we are also, and it's incredible that we've been able to keep going throughout the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, but we're also making record investments in our, yes it is, and we're also making record investments in our NHS. We have more doctors, more nurses working in our NHS than at any time in the history of that magnificent organisation. And rather than running down what they're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, and casting doubt on their efforts, he should get behind them, and he should support our booster campaign.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there we have it. Prime Minister, I deny my hospital building programme has been flagged red as unachievable, but I don't have the confidence to publish the report. Mr. Speaker, the more we look at this promise, the murkier it gets. I've got a document here sent by the Department of Health to the NHS. It's called the New Hospital Programme Communications Playbook. I kid you not. It offers advice, Mr. Speaker, to make it easier to talk about the programme. Now, you might think that everyone knows what a new hospital is. I certainly thought I knew what a new hospital is before I read this document. But this guide instructs everybody to describe refurbishments and alterations on existing hospitals as new hospitals. We can all agree that refurbishments are a very good thing, but they're not new hospitals. So, Prime Minister, how many of the 40 are fix-up jobs on existing hospitals, and how many are actually the new hospitals he promised?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, you obviously don't always go around building on greenfield sites. What we are doing is massive. You rebuild hospitals, and that is what we have said for the last 2.5 years, Mr. Speaker. It is the biggest programme of hospital building this country has ever undertaken. It's being made possible by this people's government, and it's in addition to what we're doing with the community diagnostics hubs, Mr. Speaker, and it's in addition to what we're doing in investing in our NHS. And I said it once, but I'll say it again. They had the opportunity to vote for that 36 billion. They turned it down, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with the people's priorities. They're playing politics.
And no wonder so many Tory donors paid so much for that wallpaper last year. It probably told them it was building a new flat. It's the same old story from this Prime Minister, week in, week out, defending the indefensible and broken promises. His mates were found to be corrupt. He tried to get them off the hook. Downing Street throws parties during lockdown. He says, not a problem. He promised there'd be no tax rises. Then he put up tax. He promised there'd be a rail revolution in the north. Then he cancelled the trains. He promised no one would have to sell their home for care. Then along came his working class dementia tax. He promised 40 new hospitals, and even if you count the paint jobs, his own watchdog says he can't deliver it. Isn't this the truth, Mr. Speaker, that any promises from this Prime Minister aren't worth the manifesto paper they're written on?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman dribbles on. dribbles on irrelevantly about wallpaper and parties, playing politics. And by the way, on that, I'm told that when the Deputy Leader and Shadow Secretary of State for the Future of Work was told that she wasn't invited, she denounced it. She denounced it as idiotic, childish, and pathetic, Mr. Speaker. They're getting on with factional. They're getting on with factional infighting. We are delivering for the people of this country. Today, cutting tax for the lowest paid people in this country. As a result of our universal credit changes, 1.9 million families getting £1,000 more in their pay packets this year. The biggest programme of rail infrastructure this century, Mr. Speaker. 3 new high-speed lines, and we're fixing social care. They have no plan whatever, Mr. Speaker. And don't forget, their resort to absolutely every problem is either to take this country back into lockdown or to open up to uncontrolled immigration, Mr. Speaker. That is their approach. We are delivering on the people's priorities, and we have more people in work now as a result of the balanced and proportionate approach that we are taking than we had before the pandemic began. And if we listened to him, Mr. Speaker, if we listened to Captain Hindsight, we'd all still be in lockdown. And that is the truth.
To hear to Mr. Rosendale. If you don't, come on, Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that we will not be able to stop the endless waves of illegal migrants crossing the English Channel until we break free from the constraints of the European Convention on Human Rights, which impedes our ability to tackle this tragic situation and protects even the most violent criminals from being deported. So, will the Prime Minister agree with me that it is time to take back control and fulfil our manifesto commitment in 2015 to get rid of Labour's Human Rights Act and bring in a British Bill of Rights?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, but we will certainly review the human rights system. But in the meantime, there is something we can do, or we can all do, on next Tuesday and Wednesday, Mr. Speaker, because our Borders Bill is coming back to this House after long gestation, and it gives us the power to make the distinction at last between illegal and legal migrants to this country. It gives us the power gives Border Force the power to turn people back from this at sea, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, it gives us the power. It gives us the power to screen people and send them for screening overseas rather than in this country. Now, will that I'm not going to ask them, I'm going to tell them. It'd be a great thing, Mr. Speaker, if the party opposite backed our Borders Bill and undermined the criminals.
Young SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on disability, and of course our thoughts are very much with all of those that are recovering from Storm Arwen, and with the Leader of the Opposition. Of course, we commemorate World AIDS Day, and I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, that the thoughts of yourself in this House will be with the family and friends of Siobhan Cathegan, the Scotland rugby player, aged 26, who unfortunately died over the course of the weekend, having had won 19 caps for Scotland. Mr. Speaker, it is deeply regrettable that once again that we're forced to spend so much time in this House discussing the Prime Minister's misconduct. But when the person in charge so blatantly breaks the rules, it needs to be talked about. Last Christmas, the Prime Minister hosted a packed party in Downing Street, an event that broke lockdown rules. Rules that everyone else was expected to follow. Now, the Prime Minister might be denying it, but I've spoken to the Mirror newspaper this morning, and they are confirming what happened, and they have legal advice on potential illegality. At a time when public health messaging is so vital, how are people possibly expected to trust a Prime Minister when he thinks it's one rule for him and one rule for everybody else.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think they should concert their line of attack more closely. I've said before that he's talking total nonsense. I think he would have been better off, frankly, saying something about the victims of Storm Arwen in Scotland and what we want to do. I'm afraid if I didn't hear it, he was drowned out by his supporters. But I think what we need to do is work together. The government of the UK working with the Scottish authorities to help those people get their power back, and that's what we're doing.
Ian Blackford.
This graceful answer, and clearly the Prime Minister can't even listen because I mentioned Storm Arwen. Mr. Speaker, the real reason why all this matters is because we find ourselves at another very difficult moment in this pandemic. This is at a time where leadership matters, when truth matters, and when trust really matters. Only this morning, leaked sage advice confirms that the UK government's current international travel restrictions will identify significantly fewer cases. That is exactly the same advice that the Prime Minister received from the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales on Monday, and he has ignored that advice. Since then, other countries, like Ireland and the US, are moving rapidly on international travel to protect their people. So will the Prime Minister finally convene a four-nation COBRA meeting to tighten travel restrictions, or will he continue to ignore the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government and his own sage advisers and imperil the health of the public of these islands?
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman, and of course we want to work closely with him, and there will be abundant opportunities today and the weeks ahead to concert our activity. But he's simply wrong in what he says about the steps that the government has taken to prevent the seeding of this variant from abroad. This country was actually the first to respond, Mr. Speaker, and for the 10 countries that are most likely to seed new variant, to seed Omicron in this country, we've put them on the red list, Mr. Speaker, so they have not only pre-departure tests, but they are also quarantined, Mr. Speaker, and I have to say that he is not right in what he says, and every other country in the world, 100%, I don't mind if he shouts, Mr. Speaker, I will tell him very calmly and quietly, 100% of the passengers arriving from every other country in the world must take a PCR test, and they cannot get out of quarantine, Mr. Speaker, unless they test negative. Those are balanced and proportionate measures designed to protect the British people from the Omicron variant, and that's the right approach to take.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, Britain has some of the most unaffordable childcare in the developed world, which reduces opportunities for working families, particularly single parents, deepens gender pay gaps and makes levelling up much harder. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss the proposal in my just published policy paper, Poverty Trapped, for an immediate review to design out these internationally uncompetitive costs while still delivering a safe and enriching level of care for our children too?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend. He is completely right about the importance of childcare and the transformative influence it can have, and that's why we've spent £3.5 billion in each of the last 3 years on free childcare entitlements, particularly for the most disadvantaged. But I'm always happy to meet my right honourable friend and to discuss his ideas further.
Ed Davey.
Speaker, farmers across our country are crucial to our nation's prosperity, shown once again through the pandemic. But many are now on the brink. Farmers across the country in villages like Hodnett, Baschurch, Woodseaves and countless others are about to see their payments cut by at least 5% starting this very month. The Prime Minister promised a new support system rewarding more sustainable farming. Yet in the meantime, he seems prepared to see many British farms go bankrupt. There's an easy solution, Mr. Speaker. Stop cutting the current system's essential payments until the new scheme is fully rolled out. Will the Prime Minister do that and help our struggling farmers before it's too late?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think British Food and Farming does an absolutely outstanding job, and it is growing the whole time. Last night I met representatives of the UK food and farming industry, which we support and we continue to support with the same level of payments, Mr. Speaker. But what we're also doing is opening up new opportunities for them around the world, and I can tell him that in every single embassy now there is a dedicated expert on supporting UK food and farming exports to the rest of the world, which supports 4 million jobs in this country, 4 million jobs in this country, and earns this country £21 billion of revenue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More needs to be done to tackle the people trafficking gangs that exploit migrants across Europe, promising to get into this country. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that it is totally unacceptable that companies like Facebook allow those smugglers to offer their services on their platforms, not only routes into the country, but also selling them forged British papers in order to aid their access? Does he agree with me that when this House passes the online safety bill, we'll have the power to do more to make companies like Facebook take down content that promotes illegal activity?
Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right that too many of these gangs are using social media, and that's why the online harms bill is so important, and it will indeed be of assistance to us in taking down that kind of material.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women have been left with internal damage and pain that they describe as being like razor blades inside them. Many have lost their careers and some have even lost their lives. It is impossible to know exactly how many women are left suffering. So why will the Prime Minister not give these mesh-damaged women the redress that they were recommended in the Cumberledge report?
Prime Minister.
I'm very grateful to her, and she raises an extremely important issue, and one that I know has caused a phenomenon that has caused huge distress to many, many women in this country. We published the Cumberledge report. If there's anything more that we can do, I'm certainly willing to look at it. I'm grateful to her for raising it.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
The levelling up agenda has already changed so many areas of our country for the better. And in my constituency, in Worksop particularly, our town centre is in desperate need of regeneration and to finally solve our flooding problems. But unfortunately, my council in Bassetlaw missed the deadline for the latest round of grants.
Labour-run council.
What can this government do to help support areas like mine who have struggled with their bids in order to make sure they are successful the next time around?
I thank you I thank my honourable friend very much. Well, the step number one is to vote out those dozy Labour councillors, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell him and I thank him for the excellent representation he gives to Bassetlaw, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell him the second round of bidding for the Levelling Up Fund will open in the spring of next year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Between 2010 and 2019, West Midlands Police lost 2,221 officers, whilst the force should receive an additional 1,200 new recruits by 2023 via the Police Uplift Programme. That still leaves a shortfall of 1,000 officers. This lack of frontline police has left the force stretched and under significant pressure, with officers actually telling me there are simply insufficient resources to investigate every crime. Will the Prime Minister commit to providing West Midlands Police with a fairer funding deal to ensure the force can return officer numbers back to 2010 levels?
Mr. Speaker, I thank her for drawing attention, and I thank her. I thank the police officers in the West Midlands, but I thank her for drawing attention to what we're doing to increase the number of police officers, because we are on track. Of our 20,000 that I pledged on the steps of Downing Street 2.5 years ago, Mr. Speaker, we've already recruited another 11,000. And I'm proud to say that our police officer workforce is more representative of the whole of this country, with more women, more people from ethnic minorities than ever before.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, the Honourable Fabian Picardo, appeared before the European Scrutiny Committee and gave evidence about the continuing negotiations between Gibraltar and the European Union on their future relationship. During the course of his evidence, the Chief Minister made clear that his ambition was that Gibraltar's future should be, as he put it, British, British, British. Yeah. Can my right honourable friend say what the government is doing to support the First Minister to achieve that aim, and in particular to exclude any role for the European Court of Justice?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and frankly I can't really improve on the verdict of my friend Fabian Picardo, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is British, 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 and will remain so. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, I see no future role for the European Court of Justice.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Edinburgh West has some of the most polluted streets in our country. An estimated 1 in 29 deaths in Edinburgh is related to air pollution, and we don't meet WHO guidelines. So will the Prime Minister meet with me and discuss whether his government can support my private member's bill to tackle that issue, bring us into line and let us all breathe a little easier?
I thank her for what the issue she mentions. It's incredibly important, but that's why we're moving now to all-out electric vehicles across the whole of the country, faster than any other European country. And our clean air strategy has been praised by the World Health Organization as an example for the rest of the world to follow. And we'll be setting out our evidence-based approach and the targets that we're setting. But of course, I'll be very happy to make sure that she meets the relevant minister to set out her case.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the drug company Pfizer announced a successful trial of a new treatment called Paxlovid. The trial showed the drug to be roughly 90% successful at stopping death or better. The vaccine strategy today is an enormous success, but it leads to a never-ending biological arms race against a mutating virus. As a supplement to the vaccine strategy, this treatment will allow governments around the world to avoid the need for future emergency restrictions. What's the government doing in the short term to secure supplies of this revolutionary treatment, and in the long term to enable factories to be built here to produce it in Britain?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and he's spot on. Of course, the rollout of Paxlovid within the UK, within the NHS, will depend on approval by the MHRA, but the government has, as a precaution, already invested in hundreds of thousands of courses of that drug.
Jessica Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wales has 11% of the UK rail network, yet only receives 2% of UK rail enhancement funding, and as reported in Wales Online, will be denied billions of consequential funding from HS2. So having under-delivered on rail in the north, having under-delivered on rail in Wales, why should anyone trust this government to deliver on its promises?
I'm afraid she's completely failed to look at what Sir Peter Hendy set out in his union connectivity review, a fantastic agenda for change and improvement, particularly in Wales, and particularly on the North Welsh corridor, where I think the railway links deserve to be improved and will be improved under this government.
Tom Randall.
Mr. Speaker, getting investment into Gedling is important. And at the previous PMQs, I put aside my political differences with Labour-run Gedling Borough Council to champion its Levelling Up Fund bid, which, like other funding bids it's made, was sadly unsuccessful. So does my right honourable friend agree with me it's important that councils like Gedling now take stock and learn from this experience? And can you confirm that help from government will be available to do that, so that in future, hopefully, Gedling and other councils will be able to make more successful bids?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. We're very happy to help Gedling and other Labour-run councils to get their act together where necessary, and to put those bids in. And just to remind him, more Levelling Up Fund bids come due in the spring of next year, and I wish Gedling well in their future bids.
Imran Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, my grandfather, along with thousands of others, came to this country 70 years ago, working 7 days a week in squalid conditions to help rebuild this country. Yet now the Home Secretary's Nationality and Borders Bill means she can revoke our British citizenship and deport us for even the most minor wrongdoings. Given the government's and the Home Office's horrific track record with their treatment of minorities, the hostile environment and the Windrush scandals, let me ask the Prime Minister the burning question that is now on the lips of everyone from a BAME background right across the country. When is he coming for me?
that the honourable gentleman opposite should look at the Conservative front bench today, and he should withdraw what he's just said, Mr. Speaker. He should withdraw it. What he said is absolutely shameful, and he knows full well the Borders Bill does nothing of the kind. It helps us to fight the evil gangs who are predating on people's willingness to cross the Channel in unseaworthy boats, and I would have thought, Mr. Speaker, that a sensible Labour Party would support it.
Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Saturday is Small Business Saturday, and I'm proud to represent some fantastic local businesses like K's of Grantham, the Stamford Notebook Company and the Bourne Bookshop. This government has provided unprecedented support throughout the pandemic. Can the Prime Minister assure me that his commitment to our high streets will continue long into the future?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for all the support he gives to Grantham and Stamford, and I can tell him that Small Business Saturday is receiving huge support from the government. We had a kind of festival last night to celebrate it in Downing Street, and I encourage everybody to get out this Saturday, Mr. Speaker, and safely with your mask on, Mr. Speaker, when you're in your shop. But that should be no inhibition on people buying in their shops up and down this country.
Final question, Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week, the 97th victim of the Hillsborough tragedy will receive the freedom of Liverpool. Andrew Devine passed away earlier this year, aged 55, having defied the odds to survive the injuries he sustained at Hillsborough, aged 22. A coroner's inquest in Liverpool in July ruled that he was unlawfully killed as a result of the disaster, making him the 97th victim. Following my tabling last week of an early day motion on Hillsborough and a national curriculum, will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me to discuss the rollout of the Hillsborough Real Truth Legacy Project, including the addition of the Hillsborough disaster to the national curriculum, and help to consign to history the narrative of lies and smears peddled by some elements of the media and establishments over the last 32 years through the power of education?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for the powerful point that he has just made, because even though 32 years have passed since that devastating tragedy, I know that the wounds remain very raw in Liverpool. And what I can say to him is that the government is committed, as he knows, to continuing engagement with the families of the bereaved, and to making sure that the lessons from that tragedy continue to be properly learned, and that the victims of Hillsborough are never forgotten, Mr. Speaker. But I'm also happy to make sure that he meets the relevant minister to take forward an agenda I think is shared by people up and down this country.
We're now going to come to the statements. Those who wish to leave, can they please leave quickly and quietly? There. Yeah, don't worry. All right, Tom. We got through. Rosie, put that phone down. I know, she's got the phone on. She's not answering her phone. Right, we now come to the ministerial statement from the Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. I now call the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, sir, I'd like to make a statement on the electricity disruptions as a result of Storm Arwen, and to inform the House on how we are working to ensure power is restored to people's homes. Storm Arwen brought severe weather, including high winds of up to 100 miles an hour, rain, snow and ice, causing the most severe disruption since 2005. Many people across the country, but particularly in northern England and Scotland, have been without power for a number of days. 3 people have tragically lost their lives in incidents related to the storm. My thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of the whole House, are with those people and their loved ones. I also want to reassure people who are still without power, who are exhausted, who are worried, and who are angry, that we are all working incredibly hard to make sure that their normal conditions return. We have incredibly dedicated teams of engineers who have been working all round the clock to restore the network. The scale of the restoration effort engineers are facing is enormous. The weekend saw exceptionally strong winds, as I said, of almost 100 miles an hour, which have brought large trees and debris down onto power lines. For example, in central Scotland, wind speeds like this have only been seen twice in the last 25 years. And of course, to add to this complex situation, much of the damage is in remote and hard to reach places. I'm glad to say that over 95% of those affected by the storm, over 935,000 customers, have had their power supply restored so far. And I'd like to thank the engineers for their hard work and perseverance. However, there are still 30,000 as of 8 o'clock this morning who are without power. And the specific areas most severely affected are the Wear Valley, surrounding Eastgate and Northumberland, the North Peak District and the South Lake areas, as well as Aberdeenshire and Perthshire in Scotland. Today, my right honourable friend, the Energy Minister, is on the ground in Berwick to see firsthand the impact from storm disruption. Yesterday, I spoke with the CEOs of Northern Power Grid, the Electricity North West, and Scottish and Southern Energy Networks to seek assurance that restoration is happening as fast as is humanly possible. I am satisfied that these operators are sharing their resources through mutual aid agreements and through putting engineers to the worst affected areas. And I'm extremely grateful to emergency responders who have also been working very hard to keep people as comfortable as possible, providing torches, blankets, and other necessities. Also, to sorting out alternative accommodation where necessary. Officials in my department are monitoring the situation very closely and are in constant contact with network operators to ensure that customers can be reconnected as quickly as possible. For people still experiencing issues and difficulties, or people who need further support, they should contact their electricity network operator by dialing 105 from their landline or mobile phone. This will automatically route them to the right operator based on their physical location. People are also eligible for compensation that whose details they can find on the Ofgem website. For those who continue to be without power, I know their primary question will be, when will power be restored? I have been assured that the overwhelming majority of those still without power today will be restored in the next day or two. I have asked operators to provide named contacts for MPs, and I will be sharing those with colleagues. This has been an extremely difficult week for many of our constituents, and I want to thank them for their fortitude in the face of this extreme weather condition. When the power is back up and back to normal, we, of course, in BEIS will be looking at the lessons that we can learn from Storm Arwen in order to build an even more resilient power system in the future.
Now come to Shadow Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? And let me, first of all, join him in sending my condolences to the victims who've tragically died during Storm Arwen and to their families. And I also want to express my sympathy to all of those who have lost power and have suffered during this crisis. I know from my own constituency in 2019, when we had terrible flooding, the impacts of extreme weather and the traumatic effects it has on people and communities. And I also want to join him in paying tribute to the many engineers, volunteers and emergency service workers who have worked tirelessly to step up and help during this crisis. Mr. Speaker, we've heard heartbreaking stories of outages leaving residents without power, water and light. And there are also, and I want to ask him about this in a moment, there are also many reports which you will have heard of residents being unable to get proper information about what is happening and people waiting for hours to get through on phone lines. So on behalf of the many who've suffered, I want to ask him a few questions. Does he believe there is enough support for the most vulnerable on the ground while the power outages continue, including the use of emergency generators, and has he given thought to calling in the army if necessary to help with that process? He said that power would be restored in the next day or two for the overwhelming majority. Can he say how many people he estimates will be left without power, and how long it will take to restore power for them. And then I want to probe him a little bit further on the question of learning lessons, which he said at the end of his statement, because after terrible storms in 2013, Mr. Speaker, the stormiest winter in 40 years that saw hundreds of thousands lose their power, it was said at the time that lessons would be learned. And I want to just probe him on three areas. First, on communications and information, the Science and Technology Committee recommended that the single national emergency number was put in place, and the purpose of that number was that people would not just know who to call, but could get information promptly. And as I say, the calling of 105, which he mentioned, there are multiple reports of it causing enormous frustration to people and them not getting the information. Can he say what his assessment is of whether people have been able to get the information, and if not, why not? Secondly, and he drew attention to this, Ofgem recommended in the wake of those storms that district network operators should share resources and personnel in the event of such a crisis. He says it has happened, but is he satisfied it has happened right across the DNO network and has happened at the scale that is required? I'd like him to answer that and just give us some further information. And third, after 2015, there was clear sense of the vulnerabilities about the overhead power network, and there was agreement that the networks would survey the vulnerabilities that they faced and act. Is he satisfied at this stage that this has happened? Because the continued vulnerability of power lines seems all too apparent. And Mr. Speaker, that's where I want to end, because faced with the climate crisis, extreme weather events will sadly become all the more common in the future. We cannot be this vulnerable in the future. There is real concern that some lessons haven't been learned, and on this occasion, we must face up to those lessons and learn them.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, of course, as far as the emergency of and the situation with regard to climate change, he and I have very similar views on this, and clearly Storm Arwen was an event the like of which we haven't seen for certainly 16 years since the records of the DNOs starts, and we have to be prepared for similarly extreme, difficult weather conditions in the future. We have to make sure that our system is resilient in that eventuality. In terms of his specific questions, we do have the 105 line, which is the one number that people are being asked to call. It has been centralised. I think he's quite right to say that there was initial pressure. From my understanding, was that over the weekend it took people up to 2 hours to get through, which was clearly unacceptable. But of course the storm hit, and the companies didn't have the communication networks, the call centres, the people there to deal with the situation. Today, and certainly yesterday when I spoke to the CEOs of the companies, that waiting time had been reduced to 10 minutes to a quarter of an hour. That's what I was told. But of course, if people are finding difficulties, they should definitely get in touch with their MPs and with government, and also the district, the distributors. On his second point, the new SAC is a very, very effective means by which the generating companies can share and deploy engineers across different networks. And that, I'm told by the CEOs of the companies, is being very effective. But I will have more calls today with local resilience leaders to make sure that what the generating companies are saying is actually matched by what people are experiencing on the ground. Because, of course, there can obviously, as he well knows, be a mismatch between the two.
Andrew Power.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I echo the words of my right honourable friend in thanking all of those in our emergency services and indeed the local authority workers that went out over the weekend and have been doing so much to support our communities across the United Kingdom that have been affected, and actually indeed the people in local businesses who have opened their doors to look after those people who are more vulnerable, and indeed support places like the Five Farms in Braemar where temperatures dropped below zero over the weekend and they were lost without power and water. But Lumfannon, Crathy and indeed Creggar from my constituency do remain without power and don't even have access to a temporary generator. So I was wondering if he could expand on his discussions with SSEN and what discussions he might have had with the Scottish Government to see what the two governments in this country might be able to do to speed up the response and to support those people who are going to their 5th day now without any power, heating or electricity in general.
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend will accept that it is an extreme situation we're in. He will also know that I've spoken to Mr. Alistair Phillips-Davis, who's the head of SSE, and he and I, as well as colleagues in the Scottish Government, are apprised of the situation. In terms of generators, they are distributing generators that can actually take up the slack when important power infrastructure is down. But it's an ongoing situation. I'll be very happy to engage with him in the next few hours.
SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. This storm was of incredible strength when it hit us on Friday night in the northeastern parts of Scotland and England, being especially in the full face of the gale. SSE's storm models predicted between 60 and 100 high-voltage faults. In actual fact, they've sustained over 500 high-voltage faults with over 1,000 instances of damage to their network. Sustained winds with gusts of in excess of 90 miles an hour and unusually from the northeast, affecting trees which don't normally have to yield to those winds, resulting in the colossal tree damage to the network. Mr. Speaker, I wish to pay tribute to the fortitude and resolve of the many people facing severe hardship on day 5 without power, some of whom won't get it back today or tomorrow. It's a tremendous disruption to the way that we live today, and they're to be in our thoughts at this very challenging time for them. Indeed, as of 9 p.m. last night, 9,500 customers remain cut off from their supply, including 5,700 in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, 1,500 in Murray, 1,400 in my Angus constituency and 570 in Perthshire. This enduring lack of power would test anybody's resolve, Mr. Speaker, yet it's telling that people remain mindful of the extraordinary efforts of engineers and support staff of SSE and their industry partners to restore supplies, and power has been restored to 118,000 customers. The UK Government has, I understand, said that it's on standby to provide further assistance to the Scottish Government, but like the Deputy First Minister in Scotland, I'm a little bit sceptical as to what that is. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could elaborate on what that assistance would be, and if it is financial assistance, is it new money or recycled money? I was in touch with SSE again this morning, and they have assured me that they have engineers from across their network working in the North East to repair supplies, and also engineers from other networks sharing DNO resources in the enormous recovery effort, which is hampered by the prolonged scale of the damage, compounded by the locations of the damage and the types of equipment that's been damaged. I wish to place on record, finally, in closing, Mr. Speaker, my thanks to the engineers working in all weathers to restore power supplies to Angus, and to the Council and other members of the Local Resilience Partnership who have done so much to help restore supplies and in the humanitarian welfare provision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the honourable gentleman's remarks and pay tribute, as he does, not only to the fortitude of many of his constituents and other people in Scotland, but also to the tireless efforts of the engineers, the voluntary staff, the DNO, in this instance SSE, in terms of trying to deal with what is, as he recognised, an unprecedented situation. He was quite right, the honourable gentleman was quite right to point out that it wasn't only the speed, the high velocity, but also the direction of the winds that posed a huge challenge. He will know that I speak to counterparts across the border in the devolved government, devolved administration very frequently. In fact, I was on a panel with the Cabinet Secretary only yesterday, and this is something that we are talking about all the time. We haven't specified the amount of money, if there is going to be any. I don't think we've reached that conversation, but we're in constant dialogue with his colleagues in Holyrood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Areas in my constituency of Penrith and the Border and further afield have been hard hit by this power crisis. Areas like Alston, Garrigal, Nenthead, Kirby Stephen, Matterdale and North Stainmore, some of which have been restored, but some are still without power. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking the engineers at Electricity North West, the emergency services, councils and volunteers who have been working so hard at this time? And can he assure my constituents and further afield that everything is being done across government to support them, help restore power and put in place contingency measures?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend will know that this is a matter of very grave concern and focus for the government. He will also appreciate that Electricity North West has done a reasonable job in restoring I think 95% of the people affected, but clearly we want to work harder to make sure that about 6,000 people, 7,000 people who are still off the grid can get their power as soon as possible.
Tim Farron.
Speaker, I also want to send my condolences and pay respects to those who lost their lives in these awful circumstances, in particular to the family of the man who passed away in Ambleside on Friday. At least 7,000 homes in my constituency have been without power for between 3 and 5 nights, and I am immensely proud of the way that people in our community have stood up to support one another, to support their neighbours. They know who they are. I'm also grateful to those working on the ground for Electricity North West to try and fix this problem as soon as possible. But thousands are still without power in my communities and elsewhere in Cumbria, and they feel forgotten. And they're not, by many of us here, I hope, Killington, Garsdale, parts of Coniston, Orris Head, Aside, High Newton, Low Newton, Witherslack, Hincaster, Lamring, Bowston, Hutton Roof, Crook, Outgate, Haverthwaite, Sparkbridge, Backbarrow and outskirts of Windermere and other places as well are now facing a 6th night without power. Some are being told they will not have that connection fixed until the 8th of December, this time next week. The hardship caused, particularly to the elderly and other who are vulnerable, is unthinkable, which is why it's massively disappointing that it took until Wednesday for a minister to come to this House to address this issue. But it is not too late for the government to act. So I would ask the minister to do the following. Will he today task the Army to provide the support for the engineers on the ground in Cumbria to speed up fixing the problem? Will he then use the Army as well to ensure that the most vulnerable are contacted and moved into emergency accommodation today? And will he also ensure that every affected community in Cumbria is given generators to provide at least a temporary fix today so that no one has to spend a 6th night in the cold?
Yeah. So we are obviously contacting local resilience forums. We're listening to them and actually getting guidance from them as to how best to tackle the situation on the ground. You'll also appreciate that ENW, Electricity North West, have already provided 150 generators, and we'll be tasking them to see what more can be done to alleviate the extreme stress and challenging situation that many of his constituents, I know, are facing.
Richard Holden.
Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his statement today. Storm Arwen has left thousands of my constituents without power for several days, but what's been really heartening is to see how the people in my local towns and villages have really come together, particularly in Upper Weardale, Eastgate, St John's Chapel, but also in places like Quebec, Winhill, Maidenlaw, and I've also got a secondary school which is still without power, several hundred children not getting the education that they need. I'm really delighted that the Energy Minister is in North West Durham today, and I thank him for his visit and what he's doing up there. Indeed, he's contacted several local businesses on my behalf. We've got a couple of things I'd like to raise with the Minister. First of all, one of my rural surgeries has lost £10,000 worth of vaccines for the flu jab, and this will impact on their ability to roll out. Could he speak to the Department of Health for me and see if he can ensure that they get that supply reimbursed as quickly as possible due to the electricity going down and their fridges going off. Secondly, there are some very isolated communities who've been told that it may be a very long time before they can get full electricity. Can he do everything possible to ensure that they are reconnected well before Christmas? And finally, can he ensure that the government responds to positively to any request from the local resilience forum, including sending in the Army if necessary and at their request? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, he will know that I'm very keen to engage with local resilience fora and really hear from them what the best way to proceed is. He will also appreciate that we're incredibly conscious of the ramifying effects of this storm, particularly in regard to health and education, and that's something which he knows that I'm taking up within the government. And of course, finally, the isolated communities point is something which I take extremely seriously. I will be looking at this on a daily basis, and I think being without power until Christmas is simply unacceptable. I'll say that very publicly, and I'll do everything I can to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his statement, but there still remain in my constituency pockets of people without energy, and that includes people in Ryton, Blaydon, Wylam, the part that's in my constituency, and Victoria, Garesfield, Colburns, Barmore, all places that are still without energy some 6 days on. And people are really anxious and finding it extremely difficult to get through to find out information. So will you assure me that we will have direct lines and contacts for Members of Parliament so that we can get that detailed information to tell our constituents? And I'd just like to thank as well the workers who've been out there in all kinds of weather trying to reconnect people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to point out that there needs to be a way in which members, honourable and right honourable members of this House, can engage not only with the DNOs but with constituents on this. And that's something that I will be looking to. I picked up with the CEO of Northern Power Grid, which I think is the DNO relevant to her constituency, precisely on this point about communications. And he said to me that having had a slow start because this thing was completely unprecedented on the weekend, they are working very, very hard to make sure that communications are effective. And also I just want to reinforce the point I just made to my honourable friend, that we will do everything we can to make sure that the generating of electricity happens long before the dates that are being bandied about as a time when this should be up and running.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and for meeting with me yesterday to discuss the situation in High Peak, where thousands of homes have been left without power since the weekend, including places like Buxton, Chapel-on-the-Frith, Wash, Bagshaw, Sparrow Pit, Wormhill, Peak Forest, Chinley, Hayfield and more. I want to put on record my thanks to those engineers at Electricity North West, as well as those at Derbyshire County Council, the Lowlands Resilience Forum, Emergency Services and our amazing mountain rescue teams for working not just to reconnect power, but also to help the most vulnerable who've been affected. Unfortunately, there are still homes who are now experiencing their 5th day without power. So can I ask the Secretary of State to commit the government to do whatever is needed and to provide whatever resources the Local Resilience Forum request to get power back to everyone in the High Peak?
As I've said to a number of honourable members here today, we're absolutely committed to getting power back. Now, I need to reiterate this. It is the case that 95% of the people who were affected are now back. But clearly, if you're one of the 5% who is still without power, that is no solace. That's not something that is going to help you in that situation. And I think that it's absolutely incumbent on me and my department to make sure we can do whatever we can to resolve this.
Boris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd also like to acknowledge the heroic efforts of the engineers and emergency workers in seeking to restore power, and the communities, businesses and residents across my constituency that have stepped up to support the elderly, local care homes and vulnerable people who have been left without power for 5 days. But there is some important questions the Minister has to answer. When the Met Office issued a red weather warning, there was a danger to life. What steps did he take to move basic resources, bottled water, emergency generators, fuel and blankets to the affected areas? What arrangements were made to consider the deployment of the Army, the Royal Engineers, to identify alternative accommodation and establish community reception hubs for those particularly elderly people left without power and in need of support? And from where I am and where my constituents are, the performance has been lamentable. It's been a complete lack of planning and foresight, and the whole House would welcome answers to those questions, I'm sure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't accept obviously his characterisation of where we are. He will appreciate that over many years now we've had local resilience fora who have acted incredibly speedily with incredible dedication, and that they're precisely the organisations who know what the situation is on the ground, and those are the people that I and my department have been engaging with, and they are responding extremely effectively to this difficult situation.
Simon Felt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Storm Arwen hit my constituency like every other one in this House very hard. Thousands of homes were left without electricity. Thankfully, it's now down to the hundreds, but those people are now facing into their 5th night without power. Can I reiterate calls for the Minister to listen to any calls from the Local Resilience Forum to step up support from the government? But also, when it comes to lessons learned from this, so many of my constituents have come to me really dismayed by the fact they're being pushed online to get information about what's happening, where support is coming from. But if you don't have power, if you don't have broadband, you simply can't access these services. So when the government looks at this, can we make sure that actually we're looking at how we best communicate to people who've got no access to regular communications channels?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the communication point is absolutely fundamental to this. And I've spoken to the CEOs of the DNOs, and I'm speaking to the Local Resilience Forum, and we're absolutely committed to having much easier, more fluent channels of communication in the future. He will appreciate that this is something which is not going to go away. There will be other incidents in the future, and he's quite right to stress the fact that we need to have a more resilient system going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, this storm was catastrophic. It had a devastating impact, destruction really, right across my constituency and in Northumberland as a whole. It wasn't just the power, Mr. Speaker. It was the destruction of properties, of allotments, of houses, right across the piece. And people are looking towards some form of financial support from the government, because this impacts on many people who haven't got two halfpennies to rub together, and they'll need specific, targeted support from the government. I'll ask the Secretary, I nearly demoted him there, by the way. I'll ask the Secretary of State to consider what extra support that can be given. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, you know, isolation, communication. I had an old people's home who lost their electricity at 2 o'clock on Saturday morning, 2 a.m. They then had it restored on Monday afternoon. In between, the lack of communication was unbelievable. 2 people in that home, 100 years plus of age. Lots of people with dementia who were frightened, who couldn't be moved because it would mean extra confusion. This is not acceptable. Again, can I ask the Secretary of State to look at what measures the government can put in place to make sure this doesn't happen again. Communications is very, very important. And just before I sign off, what a brilliant job Northern Power Grid, the workforce, the engineers, the volunteers in the towns and villages, the council workers, what a brilliant job they're all done pulling together to try and ease the effect of Storm Arwen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable gentleman is quite right. Northern Power Grid are working very hard to make sure that people get electricity back. And as I've said, 95% of people affected have got the power back. There was an issue with communication, I'm sad to say, on the weekend. There was a huge surge of demand, and there wasn't enough infrastructure. There weren't enough people in the call centres to deal with that situation. And that's something that we're going to be looking into. Those MPs, not many of them in this House today, from the South East will remember we had a power outage on the 9th of August. And we did manage, I think, to create a more resilient system. And I'm absolutely determined that this time we can have a more resilient system on the back of these tragic events.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of my constituents across the Scottish borders remain without power today after the catastrophic storm at the weekend, and I felt the full force of that storm at home in Coldstream on Friday and Saturday. Too many old and vulnerable residents have no power, and that's been the case for 5 days now. Now, I pay tribute, like others have, to the engineers and council workers who worked so hard to get people connected, but serious questions about the failure of Scottish Power energy networks to provide accurate information to residents about reconnection times really remain. There are also questions about the support that the Scottish Government provided to local councils across Scotland. So what discussions has the UK Government had with the Scottish Power energy networks and the Scottish Government about the response to the storm, and what more can be done to support my constituents in the Scottish borders to get them reconnected?
As I said in my statement, spoke to 3 CEOs of the DNOs. Scottish Power, unfortunately, was not one of the CEOs that I speak to, but I'm very hopeful that we can get a call today, and I'm looking forward to sharing with him exactly what that particular distributor is doing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Some of my constituents in places like Sherburn Hill, Waterhouses, Bear Park and Lowburn Hall are actually facing a full 7 days without heating or electricity. And this is a national scandal. And I want to thank the emergency services, the workers, the engineers and all of those community groups who've stepped up to help those most in need. But what is the government doing to help the most vulnerable residents in Durham to get the help that they need? Not tomorrow, not next week, but today.
As I've said in a number of responses, we are working with the Local Resilience Forum. I mean, that is the job of the Local Resilience Forum in the first instance, to find out what's going on and to coordinate local responses. And then, of course, the government here is very, very focused on helping them to get what they need to make the situation much more comfortable than it currently is.
Back to North East. Jenna Davison.
Mr. Speaker, the devastation caused by Storm Arwen, I mean, we've all seen the photographs, we've all experienced it for ourselves. It's absolutely atrocious. Speaking to Northern Power Grid a few days ago, they said it's the worst damage they can remember in living memory. I just want to pay tribute to Northern Power Grid, to their engineers and to all the local authority workers for all the hard work they're doing in trying to get this awful damage fixed. I also want to thank the Secretary of State for his statement today and for the numerous calls and meetings that we've had across this week to discuss the damage and what more can be done to really support some of those residents who are still without power. In my own constituency, unfortunately, the number is still in the thousands. Places like Langdon, Beck, Evenwood, Middleton and Teesdale still facing an absolute loss of power. But I do think it's in times like these when we do see the best in our communities as well, with businesses like Babbles and Chocolate Fair providing support to individuals still affected, and individuals like Tommy Lowther, Judith Buckle, Kimberly Clark and others, including Paul Headley, who responded instantly to calls to provide a generator which had been sitting in his garage. And it's on that point about emergency generators that I really want to address the Secretary of State now. After 5 days of no power, no heating, no light, the smallest things like a single light bulb, a kettle to boil some hot water, a small heater and a little bit of phone charge can make such a difference to people. So on this note, I really want to ask what more the government and local resilience forums, local authorities, local charities can be doing to work together to find out where these generators are, to get them deployed to some of these communities who could be facing disruption for days, if not weeks.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for the tireless work that she and other members of this House, I mean across both sides, have put in to making sure that their constituents are being well represented and actually to tell us what it is exactly like on the ground. And I have to say that this is exactly how this House of Commons should be working, and I'm very proud of that. In particular, with regard to generators, she will know that that's something that we're talking with the local resilience for the companies themselves. I think in her case, it's Northern Power Grid, are actually making an effort to get generators out to affected communities, and I'm getting a regular update on what's being happening in that respect. But I'm very happy to speak to her, as other members in this House, about this emergency.
Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and like other members, could I add my own thanks to the resilience and fortitude of those who have been left without power for so long, to the dedication of the engineers who have been getting them back on grid, and also to everyone involved in the volunteer response and in the local resilience partnerships. But while the priority has to be about getting those who remain off-grid back onto an electrical supply and supporting those who aren't on grid at the moment as best we can, there will be at some point an examination of how things could have been done better. And I just wonder, as part of that, there is an issue about the resilience of our communication infrastructure as well as our power infrastructure, because broadband went down and mobile phone networks went down, which also hindered in many respects the ability of people to respond. So I wonder, will the Secretary of State consider, as part of that, looking at the obligations that are placed upon not just power distribution companies but also the telecommunications providers to be able to provide a more secure and robust service in all circumstances, no matter how adverse that might be?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to wholeheartedly agree with what the honourable gentleman has just said. I think it's very easy for us simply to come up with a statement and then hope that the problem goes away. But I've made a firm commitment, as we did, as I said, on the 9th of August 2019, when there was a power outage. We spent a couple of months, actually, if not longer, having a proper inquiry as to what went wrong. And I'm confident that a lot of the measures that we came up with then actually did provide resilience. And it's exactly in that vein that I want to approach this very, very difficult situation. It won't be the case that we'll simply walk away from it. We will be trying actively to learn lessons. We can't abolish extreme weather. Well, we can in the long run, but we can't do it perhaps as quickly as we'd like. We can certainly learn lessons to build up more resilience.
David Dewey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement today and his commitment, as well as that of the Prime Minister earlier this week, in particular his commitment to provide any support that the UK Government can in Scotland in particular. I'd like to associate myself as well with his remarks and those of other honourable and right honourable members across the House, recognising the Herculean efforts, not just of the power companies, but of local communities who have come out in force to support their neighbours and friends and neighbours around those communities. Far be it from me to... I'm not in the spirit of helping my honourable friend from Angus. The numbers he produced earlier were from, I think, 9 o'clock last night. There were some earlier numbers came out earlier today which showed that from the 9,500 customers that were still looking for power last night, that's come down to 6,400, 3,700 of those being in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. Areas like Achnagat, Forglin, Methlick and New Baith coming on stream overnight. They'll be delighted. But of course there's still 3,700 in Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City that are, for whom that's not much solace, as the Secretary of State said. So can I ask the Secretary of State what conversations he's had with the Scottish Government and the local resilience programmes in Scotland, not only to get the power back on as soon as possible, but also to make sure that those most vulnerable in our communities, those that aren't on Facebook, that aren't on the internet, that don't have access to the regular updates that we all try to give them, how are we focusing on helping those most vulnerable in our communities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. This sort of crisis doesn't affect everyone equally. There are vulnerable and isolated communities who are particularly affected by this outage, and that's where our focus is on. He will appreciate that the DNO in his area, I think it's SSE, have worked very well, actually, in terms of providing support. They're providing accommodation in some instances, hot meals, food, and we're continuing to push that.
Thanks, Davis Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for the Secretary of State for his update on the impact of Storm Arwen, and my thoughts are with everybody impacted by this terrible natural event. Residents and businesses in Pontypridd were devastated by Storm Dennis back in 2020. They were hit by horrendous flooding, and sadly they're still, even now, feeling the impact of those. And that's the point I want to make to the Secretary of State today, is that although it is vitally important that residents and businesses get that urgent help in the immediate aftermath, it's the long-term impacts that are still massively impacting these people. Some unable to get insurance at all, many hit by unnecessarily high insurance premiums, and some not even pointed to floodry at all. So will the Minister please work with colleagues to look again at floodry and ensure that everybody, businesses, residents, can get access to affordable insurance?
I think she's right, and many of us across the House have had instances of flooding and extreme weather events over the last 10 years. I myself, in my constituency, had a very extreme case of flooding in 2014, and the issues that she raised with regard to insurance and lessons learned are things that I'm very conscious of. I'd be very happy to take this up with her in any subsequent conversation or meeting.
Storm Arwen was an extreme weather event, but we're having more extreme weather events as the climate changes. And already every winter in this House we have urgent statements and urgent questions and statements on power outages caused by electricity distribution lines coming down, and also train disruption caused by electrical lines failing. The long-term fix for this is to increase the resilience standards of the poles and the pylons and the wires and the connectors on the system. This isn't to do with local resilience fora, who are more about responding to crisis. This is about raising the technical standards of the equipment that's deployed. An example is undergrounding electricity lines, which can be as much as 20 to 30 times more expensive than an overhead line. But especially near more populous areas, that may well be part of the solution. So will the Secretary of State be kind enough to go away and look at the technical standards of the electricity distribution network, because we need to raise those in the face of climate change.
He's absolutely right to raise the infrastructure challenges that we're experiencing in extreme weather conditions, which will probably be more frequent given the climate change to which he alluded. He will all appreciate that essentially paying for a whole new infrastructure not only takes time, but considerable amounts of money. And in the meantime, we have to deal with those extreme weather events. So the local resilience fora are very important. He's quite right to say that they don't solve the infrastructure problem long term, but it's really important that they can act nimbly, because we're not going to abolish, we're not simply going to abolish, we can improve our infrastructure standards. We're not going to abolish the threat of extreme weather conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The immense disruption caused by Storm Arwen over the weekend demonstrated how vulnerable much of the country is to extreme weather events. Recently, businesses and residents in my own constituency of Birkenhead were devastated by extensive flooding following torrential rainfall in the space of just a couple of hours. With climate breakdown set to make such events a more frequent occurrence, can the Secretary of State inform the House what steps his department will be taking in conjunction with his colleagues at DEFRA to improve the resilience of communities like Birkenhead to extreme weather?
I think he raises an important point, Mr. Speaker, and he also alludes to the nature of the problem. I mean, BEIS is responsible for electricity. DEFRA has been particularly effective in responding to flooding, and he's quite right to suggest that both our departments, as we do with other colleagues across government, are more and more focused on the effects of climate change, and that's what it is, on our infrastructure and our people, and we're working together to try and solve that general problem.
Final question, Jim Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement today, and would also wish to convey my party and my own sincere sympathies to the family of Francis Lagan, who was killed by a falling tree during Storm Arwen in Northern Ireland. Can the Secretary of State outline what support is available specifically for businesses who rely on internet and who may have to wait weeks for restoration? It was on the news this morning, Mr. Speaker, and it was very clear that businesses in Yorkshire and elsewhere were finding it difficult to reconnect and take bookings. So can the Secretary of State allocate an urgent funding scheme to allow short-term contract mobile hotspotting to take place in the interim, just to help those businesses as they need it right now? Thank you.
I mean, this is something which clearly is a matter of urgent discussion. He'll appreciate that in my role, I can't stand up these funds immediately, and I think a lot of the onus will be on the devolved administration as well. So I'm very happy to take that up with colleagues in Northern Ireland, as well as my right honourable friend, the member for Great Yarmouth.
We now come to the second statement, where I call Minister Keegan.